So the spirit of the law is that they do not want the landlord entering for no. Put that in your house rules, and hopefully the tenant that wants to do that will just avoid you and move on to the next landlord. And that makes it easy for your tenants to come and go. The second is to the reality is in 2025, your capacity to find tenants, vet them, get your listing up is much different than what a lot of the common fears are. And so this video is going to speak to that in 5 parts. So the first part is going to be an overview of rental types. You may have an idea of what type of rental type you want, but it is always useful to see the full landscape and the pros and cons of each rental type. The second part is going to be rental platforms. So depending on which rental type you picked, where can you find tenants for that platform? The third is going to be common landlord concerns. I'm talking to those of you that are worried about squatters. The fourth is going to be deposits versus fees. And then the fifth and final, so we're going to wrap up the video by talking about some house rules that will help stave off tenants with problematic behaviors and protect your rental property, protect your peace of mind, and hopefully also protect the right tenant. The lesson I want you as in landlords and future landlords to take from this video is that a lot of other people have been exactly where you are at right now, which is that they have a rental property. Maybe they bought one, maybe they inherited one, maybe they got one in a divorce, but they're not really sure what to do with it. And they're not sure if they have what it takes to landlord. So they've heard a lot of scary things about landlording. They've never done anything like this before, and they're not really sure where to start or if they're going to get in a lot of trouble, because with real estate investing, a lot of money is involved. And then we've also heard a lot of nightmare stories about terrible tenants, right? And then on the other side of that is someone that's 6 months past that fear. They have installed a tenant, the tenant pays their bills, they're pretty low key, they have a good relationship, they move on, the landlord gets a new tenant, and the landlord is thinking, this isn't that hard, and I'm going to invest in another rental property. So that's where we want to get you, is from someone that's a little bit nervous to someone that can property manage your own properties without having to give away that money. And the reason for that is because then you can take that extra money and you can invest it in stocks, you can invest it in Bitcoin, you can invest it in future rentals, or you can take a vacation. You can do whatever you want, but it's not really smart to be throwing away that money on property management for certain rental types. And I'll talk about that in a sec. So a couple of things to consider when you think about managing your own rental properties in 2025. So the first that I already talked about, which is that we have new technology that we didn't have in the past, and this technology makes self-property management much easier in 2025. Second is that property management is not nearly as hard or as scary as people think it is. This is in part because of that technology. It is also because people over-index on the negative. So as human beings, we are more attuned to stories that talk about a nightmare tenant that spray painted the walls or left rotting meat in the freezer, etc. But the reality is that that is the exception. That is not the rule. And that's an important mindset shift to switch into, because again, the amount of money in real estate investing often clouds people's judgments or makes them overly prone to fear. Third, so many of my consulting clients that are unhappy actually pay for property management, and they feel that the property management causes them more headaches than they solve. There's a good reason for this, and that is people often get into property management because they like the hospitality side of hosting people in their home or their properties. They're good at it. It's more interesting to them than their day jobs, and so they start hosting and property managing for other people. And with that, their role quickly shifts from hospitality to management, and all of a sudden they're having to manage their clients, which is the owners, the guests, which are the tenants, the cleaners, the handymen, the garbage schedule, etc. And so it becomes a lot more of a management profession than a hospitality profession, and people don't love that because the money doesn't necessarily match the stress and it's no longer fun. So we see this over and over again, where someone that is great at managing their own rentals grows and grows and grows until their quality goes down, and then all of a sudden they have a bunch of unhappy landlords. And so often when my consulting clients come in and they're expressing frustration with their property management, that is the core pattern behind behind it, although it can manifest all sorts of different ways, whether this is setting up tenants that aren't great or letting it sit vacant for too long. There's lots of ways that this shows up. And then fourth and final, full transparency here, I coach people on how to become landlords. So if you're interested in that, I will have a link in the description to my consulting services to learn about how to become a landlord. So the service actually removes a lot of the friction between thinking about becoming a landlord to actually becoming a landlord, and it also speeds up the process quite a bit. Okay, so let's talk about the different rental platform types. So we have short-term rentals, rent by the room, mid-term rentals, and long-term rentals. So a short-term rental is going to be any rental that's under 30 days. This is also called a vacation rental. The second is a rent by the room, and for this particular video, I'm going to talk about rent by the room in your primary residence. So in most cities, it can be for any length of time because it's in your primary residence. It's just an empty bedroom. So a lot of times we'll see empty nesters deploying this rental strategy. The third is a midterm rental. This is anything that is 30 days or more. And then finally, a long-term unfurnished rental is usually for 6 months or more. Second, okay, are they furnished? So short-term rentals, yes, they are furnished. Rent by the rooms, they can be either. There's two different strategies with this. One is to rent it furnished, and that makes it easy for your tenants to come and go. The second is to rent it unfurnished for the exact opposite reason, which is that it makes it harder for the tenants to come and go, and they will stay longer. So a rent by the room can be either. The third is a midterm rental. Midterm rentals, as a reminder, are rented for 30 days or more, and they are furnished. You can also think about them as a furnished long-term rentals. And then finally, a long-term unfurnished rental is unfurnished. All right, some quick housekeeping before we get into the next section. Please like this video if you've learned something so far or if you learned something coming up. Second, if you are a landlord that is looking for more information and tutorials on different platforms, how to do your deposits, how to collect your rent, etc., it is worth subscribing because this entire channel is dedicated to the small landlords. So landlords with 5 or fewer properties. Third, I am not a lawyer, I am not an accountant, CPA, and I am not an insurance broker. Fourth, I have freebies on my Stan Store. So again, if you go into the description of this video and click on that Stan Store link, you will see a green section, and that green section has free rental tools. So currently the freebies include a lease and a checklist for questions that you should ask your insurance. This will change in the future, and the lease will probably stay, but the checklist for insurance probably won't, or it will cost more in the future. But right now it is free, and if it gets switched out, something else free will be switched in for it. The amount of work for each rental type. So for a short-term rental, the amount of work is high because you have a lot of tenant turnover, which means you're having to find new tenants, you're having to answer their questions, you're having to hire out the laundry, cleaning, etc. So it's a lot of work. A rent by the room can be just as much work as a short-term rental, or it can be less work. It just depends on how long the tenant types come in. The next model at its baseline is less work than a short-term rental. So I'm talking about a mid-term rental, and the reason why a mid-term rental is less work than a short-term rental is just because the tenants stay a minimum of 30 days, which means you have a lot less obligation to answer communication, find new tenants, hire cleaners, etc. And often midterm renters will stay much longer than that. They'll book longer than that, or they'll extend their rentals. They might come in for a month, but then end up extending for like 4 months. And then finally, long-term unfurnished rental. This is the least amount of work by far, and that's because usually you install a tenant for 6 months or more, they pay their bill every month, and you don't think about it after that. All right, let's talk about property management costs. So in the short-term rental space, it can start as low as 15% and go as high as 50%. I do think you pay for what you get here. And because short-term rental work is a lot of work, going with a cheap property manager for short-term rentals often does not work in your favor. I think for rent by the room, especially when it's an empty nest situation, you're not hiring a property manager. Typically, people are doing this themselves. For a midterm rental, the property management hasn't really shown up yet for midterm rentals. That's also part of the reason why I coach people on how to be property managers themselves, because the issue is with a long-term rental, property managers will take usually half of the first month's rent and then 8 to 12% after that. Well, you can't really do that with a midterm rental, because if someone is coming in only for a month or 3 months, you're talking about taking half of the rental amount for the first month, and that could happen a bunch, and then also taking a cut of it going forward. So we don't really have a good model for midterm rentals yet, or at least not one that I've heard that a lot of people have been satisfied with. And then finally, long-term rentals. Again, it's pretty common for a property manager to take 50% of the first month and then take anywhere between 8 to 12% for all the subsequent months of the rental. Talk about core issues with each model. So for short-term rentals, often having property management will negate the reason to do an STR. If you're doing it yourself, the big negative is that it's just labor intensive. If you are doing a rent by the room and it's a room in your house, the negative is just that you might have a stranger at your kitchen or sharing the bathroom with you, or that you're seeing in the backyard, and not everyone loves that. Something that we're seeing in both the midterm and long-term rentals is that we're seeing the rent rate soften a little bit. With midterm rentals too, you have to pay for the cost of furnishing and you have to pay for the utilities, and sometimes that can mean that it's no smarter to do a midterm furnished rental than it would be to do a long-term unfurnished rental. And the core negative with a long-term unfurnished rental is that often long-term tenants, counter to popular belief, but often long-term unfurnished rental tenants are harder on the property because they use the appliances and they're there and they get very comfortable in their lifestyle, and they might not be moving around the furniture as much and stuff. So then you might have stains of like the furniture stayed consistent in one place, whereas if it's getting cleaned all the time, that might be different. Now let's talk about the core benefits for each rental model. So the first for short-term rentals is that you can use the property, and also, again, the tenants don't do a lot of damage because they're there for a short period of time. And if you have a problem tenant, you have a problem tenant for 4 days versus a full year. The core benefit of a rent by the room and your own property, so an empty nester situation, is that you're making money on a room that's otherwise just sitting there empty, and some money is better than no money. Core benefit of a midterm rental is that often these tenants are kind of an in-between, so you're not locked in to a long-term problematic tenant. Often we see nurses and other desirable tenant types in this midterm space. And also, if you as a landlord want to use the property, you can calendar block so that you can use it for a month when a tenant is out and then have it rented the rest of the time. I do this myself, as do a lot of my clients. And then finally, with a long-term rental, the core benefit is that it's the least amount of work. You set it and forget it. Someone else is paying your bills and you're not doing a lot of work. All right, and then in this final row, it's going to move us into the next section, which is property platforms and rental platforms. So where you are going to find tenants depending on what your rental strategy is. So for short-term rentals, you're gonna find them on Airbnb, VRBO, Booking.com. For rent by the room, you can find tenants pretty much anywhere. So you can do it on Airbnb, Furnish Finder, Zillow, etc. For midterm rentals, you're gonna find your midterm rental tenants on Airbnb, Furnish Finder, Zillow Rentals. Again, a lot of different platforms and technology starting to enter this market. And then finally, for long-term unfurnished rentals, you're gonna look at Zillow Rentals, Trulia, Apartments.com, Avail, etc. And as a note, I encourage all new landlords or all people that are thinking about the different rental platforms, when you think about Airbnb, Furnish Finder, VRBO, don't think about them as short-term vacation rental platforms. Think about them as furnished rental platforms for any length of stay. Okay, so now that we have done an overview of the different rental types and we have done an overview of the different places where you can find tenants depending on what rental strategy you go with, let's talk about some of the most common fears that landlords have. The first that comes up a lot is the right to enter or notice. So a lot of my consulting clients will ask me, should I hire a cleaner to be in the property? And the reason why they're asking this is because they want eyes on the property. Well, what you should know is that in every state, including New York and California, the landlord has the right to enter the property. So the spirit of the law is that they do not want the landlord entering for no reason, but the landlord can enter for catastrophic reasons, meaning like there's a flood in the property and somebody needs to go in and shut off the water, or they can enter with proper written notice. For some states, it's 48 hours. For other states, it's 24 hours. I have never seen anything beyond 48 hours, but it's got to be written notice and you've got to explain why you're coming in, and you can do a checkup. That is fine. Now, the reason why I don't like the idea of having cleaners on site is I'm a clean person, so as a tenant, that would turn me off because I can't believe that I'm not going to be forced to incur that cost. You can say it's free all day, but my belief is that I'm ultimately going to have to pay for that. So in Colorado, for instance, landlords have to test the smoke alarms, and it can't be the tenant that does it, and we have to do it once a year. So you could do this every time you have a new tenant in and just tell them it's your annual check, even if it's your fourth check in the same year. But the other reason why I don't like this is, let's say you enter and they have a lifestyle that you don't love. Well, what are you going to do about it? It's not against their lease for them to be messy or to have dishes in the sink in a way that you wouldn't. So be cautious in implementing this, because you can get eyes on the property, but really a best practice here is to vet up front and to trust your tenant and not be paranoid and in their property and in their business and in their lifestyle all the time after they've rented. That's not a good situation for anyone. So we just want to avoid that, but also know that as the landlord, you do have the right to enter your property in every single state in the United States. Okay, second, adverse possession issues, aka squatters, the big worry that everyone has. I don't worry about this at all, and here's why. So there are some basic requirements that a potential squatter would have to fulfill to squat in a property, and I'll talk about it in Colorado. So in Colorado, the first requirement is that the claimant must physically use the property as an owner would, such as by building, cultivating, or making improvements on the land. I think this also means just living there. Second, it has to be open and notorious. So the possession must be obvious to anyone, including the legal owner. So including you as the owner and the neighbors and everyone else. So they can't just be hiding in there. Third, it has to be exclusive. So the claimant must possess the property alone and not share possession with the legal owner of the public. Meaning your ex-boyfriend can't claim a right to the property because he lived there, because you still live there and you own the property. Same thing with adult children, same thing with rent by the room. If you are there, they can't claim it. Next is that it has to be continuous. So the claimant must use the property uninterrupted for the statutory period. And it's the statutory period that we really care about. So this is the statutory period for adverse possession, aka squatting in Colorado, which is actually 18 years. In certain circumstances, it can be reduced to 7 years, but we see these timelines for a lot of states. And the reason is that, again, the law is intended to protect the landlord. And when I approach this, I think there is no chance that someone could live in my property and not pay me rent and I wouldn't know for 7 years. And I think probably you're not rich enough to not notice that either. So unless you are just completely neglecting the property, you're going to catch a squatter, and therefore they're not going to be able to move into an adverse possession situation. That isn't to say that you won't run into a situation where you're going to have to evict someone. That does happen occasionally. But what I am saying is that it's very unlikely that a squatter is going to come in and then own your property per legal instruments of the United States. Okay, third, LLCs. So what is an LLC and when would you use one? So the purpose of an LLC is to isolate your assets per business, and your rental is a business. If you put it in an LLC, your liability, so what a tenant can sue you for, should be limited to that particular rental. This means that the tenant cannot go after your savings, your stocks, etc. So a note on this, when you open a business bank account, you'll have to do an LLC to do that. And you want to make sure that all money flows in and out of that bank account that you set up with your LLC, because if you don't, you aren't protected anymore by that LLC status. All right, moving into section 4, deposits versus fees. So what is the difference between a deposit and a fee? So a deposit is refundable. A fee is a one and done. It's something that is not going to get refunded. Some other research that you should be doing around deposits in your area is whether or not the deposit needs to be in an interest-bearing account versus a non-interest-bearing account. How much you can charge for a deposit, because some states have limitations on how much you can charge for a deposit, what you can use a deposit for, and what the rules are around when you have to return the deposit. And again, this is often going to be on a state by state or a city by city level. So it's not something I can tell you. It's something that you need to be aware of and that you need to learn about. And I can teach you, do the research on it, or I can do the research for you if you are looking for more coaching around that. But the core issues with the deposits, again, are going to be interest bearing versus non-interest bearing, what you can charge for, what you can use the deposit for, how long you hold the deposit for, and how much. All right, and fifth and final section to close out this video, some best practices to help you avoid a problem tenant and or protect yourself, your property, and the right tenant. So the first thing that you want to put in your house rules is no turning off the Wi-Fi. You want to just put a note in there that the Wi-Fi is in a lockbox or that the Wi-Fi cannot be shut off during the day. This is different if it's a long-term unfurnished rental and they're paying for the Wi-Fi, then they have the right to do whatever they want. But if you are in a midterm, short-term, or rent by the room, you are probably paying for the Wi-Fi and you do not want them turning it off, because it just raises a lot of questions around why someone would want the Wi-Fi off during the day. Now, maybe some people have legitimate security concerns, but if that's the case, they need to disclose that to you before they ever show up or explain why they would need that circumstance. A tenant that shows up and is turning off the Wi-Fi all the time is a tenant that you should be concerned about. So just put that in your house rules, and hopefully the tenant that wants to do that will just avoid you and move on to the next landlord. The second thing you want to put in your house rules is that anyone that is staying that's 18 or older for 5 or more consecutive nights, or let's say 10 or more consecutive nights, needs to be disclosed. This will help prevent unwanted or unknown about subleasing. It will prevent, when you have a multiple roommate situation, one roommate moving in a spouse or a partner that the other roommates aren't happy about because that spouse or partner is sucking up or using the utilities and they're having to absorb that and pay for rent. So that's another way to prevent that. And then the final thing that it will help prevent is sometimes you will see a trend of like moms renting on Airbnb, and then so you'll have like 55-year-old Deborah from Iowa renting, and then an 18-year-old kid will show up, which isn't necessarily what you as the landlord prepared for or bargained for. So it will help prevent that. And then a final note for house rules, and this is relevant to like Airbnb where you don't necessarily have a lease, is to just say, per my state law, I can enter the property with 24 to 48 hours written notice. And so you're just giving the tenant the heads up that this is the state law and that you are treating them more like a long-term rental. And this is important in the midterm space, because often you'll see people that shop like short-term renters in the midterm space, but then they act like long-term renters once they're actually installed. And you should also be thinking about this as the landlord. Treat them as short-term renters before they show up, but then also start to treat them as long-term renters once they're there. That is the right way to approach midterm rentals or those platforms like Airbnb where you don't necessarily have a lease. So I hope that video was informative, if not exhaustive. Just know that lots of people go from having no properties and no experience to being successful landlords. And if you are doing research on YouTube, there's every reason to believe that you fall into that category.